employees and allies. My name is Ryan Howe. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a co-chair of the GSA. And we're happy to have both CDPHE staff and folks from other state agencies on the trainings this morning. CDPHE and the GSA are hosting both LGBTQ basics and later in the month bystander intervention trainings to continue improving education around LGBTQ plus topics during Pride Month. But even though we're talking about them this month, we should definitely be carrying them on throughout the rest of the year and being an ally year round. Some quick housekeeping for today's session. Myself and a few others will be engaging with you in the chat, so please enter comments or questions you have in there and we'll make sure to get them addressed. Please keep yourself muted at all times unless you are asking a question. We will do our best to get your questions answered. Throughout the session, at the end, there will be time for Q&A. I know that this was, in the registration form, it stated that you needed to be here for the full 2 hours, so I would just ask that you guys be respectful of that and stay for the entire session. Around 30 minutes, with about 30 minutes left, I'll share a link out to the evaluation form for everyone to fill out. So keep an eye on that. And then with that, I'm pleased to turn over the session to our host, Johnny Humphrey, with the Center on Colfax. Johnny is the Director of Inclusivity Services at the center. And thank you so much for being here today, Johnny.
Thank you, Ryan. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning. Happy Pride Month. My name is Johnny Humphrey, and I am just going to queue up our presentation here. So bear with me for 1 second. I've got 3 monitors, so just so you know, I'm looking all over the place. So I hope that's not a distraction. But yes, so my name is Johnny Humphrey, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And I am very excited to be with you today. So we are going to be covering LGBTQ plus basics, an introduction to the LGBTQ plus community. First and foremost, I want you to know that as we go through this material, there may be some of you that are really familiar with a lot of these terms, and that is wonderful. I have no expectations or assumptions about what you know or what you don't know. So these may be some newer terms that you're not familiar with, and I am excited to share them with you. I put in the chat just a moment ago, and then I'd sent the link last week, but I have a workbook that you are more than welcome to either follow through or have available to look at later. We're going to go over some basic language and terminology, but that workbook has significantly more terminology that you are welcome to look at. And then there are some activities that we may or may not take to cover today, but I think they're interesting and I wanted you to have access to them. One in particular that we won't cover during this time that we have together, but I do invite you to take advantage of is a first impressions activity. And just it asks a few questions, just kind of reflecting on your first impressions about the LGBTQ plus community. There are no wrong answers to that. And so I do invite you later perhaps to participate in that activity in particular. Okay, so again, I mentioned my name, Johnny Humphrey. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the Director of Inclusivity Services at the Center on Colfax. And my role primarily is to lead a program which is called Range Consulting. This enables me the opportunity to work with organizations just like yours, companies, nonprofit, and other agencies and entities around the state and throughout the country and beyond to provide cultural competency on the best practices for supporting the LGBTQ plus community, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning communities, as well as we use the acronym IDEA, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, equity and accessibility strategies for management and HR within all of these sectors that I mentioned just a moment ago. This is personal to me. It's what I consider to be a passion project. I identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And so it's just a privilege for me to be able to share this information with you. Just on a personal note, I live in Golden, Colorado with my boyfriend, and I love to share a little picture of our dog, Ada. She is 8 months old, and she was just a delight, but certainly a handful, as you can imagine puppies being. Just to give some context, to describe myself, just for those that may have limited visibility, I want to in the spirit of inclusivity, sharing a little bit to describe myself. I'm a white, middle-aged man with short brown hair. I've got a beard that's salt and pepper. And I'm wearing a blue button-down shirt, and I love the background. Really excited to share our center. So you have a view of what the center looks like, and we have a sunny background behind the building. So. Okay, so I shared a little bit about myself. I invite you to take advantage of the chat. And if you would feel comfortable enough just to introduce yourself, your name, if you'd like to share your role within your respective agencies. But I certainly invite you to share your pronouns. And I've got a few options that are typical, but there are many other pronouns that can be used as well. Perhaps maybe he, him, his, maybe she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, and there are other pronouns that can be used as well. So I just invite you at this time, if you feel comfortable, to do so. The reason for this is that sharing your pronouns and checking with others about what pronouns they use helps build welcoming spaces for transgender and gender diverse people, really for all of us. If someone's uncomfortable sharing their pronouns, that's all right. Simply refer to that person by their name. We make so many assumptions about people's pronouns based on their outward appearance, which is gender expression. I'll talk about that term in just a few moments. That assumption could be inaccurate and could certainly be make a person feel offended, disrespected. And so ideally, if you introduce yourself, and there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but introducing your name and sharing your pronouns. An example might be, hi, I'm Johnny Humphrey, and I go by he, him, his pronouns. I'd love to know your name and what pronouns you go by as well. Or it can be as informal as, hi, I'm Johnny, I go by he, him, his. Tell me about you. And so there's a wide variety of different ways that you can share pronouns. And so I invite you to get in the habit of doing it. I know many of your agencies already have your pronouns included in your email signatures. You might have them in your business cards as well. You're always welcome in these virtual platforms that you can rename yourself and include your pronouns. For this platform, you don't have to, but if you'd like, there are 3 buttons in the top right corner, and there's a rename space that you can actually rename yourself and include your pronouns. But thanks, everyone. I appreciate seeing you doing this. I always say the first several times it may seem awkward, maybe a little cumbersome, but the more we normalize it in doing this, it will become much, much easier. Okay, so I mentioned the Center on Colfax, and some of you may be aware of us, and several of you may not be, but we are an LGBTQ plus community center located in Denver. We're at the intersections of Lafayette and Colfax. We were founded in 1976, and we're considered to be one of the older centers in the country, and certainly the largest within the Rocky Mountain region. We typically consider between Chicago and Los Angeles, we're the largest center in this particular area. And we have a number of different programs and services. And our mission here is indicated on the slide, is to engage, empower, enrich, and advance the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community of Colorado. If you would indulge me for a moment, I would like to do a land acknowledgement to recognize the communities in which where our facility stands. We acknowledge with respect that the Center on Colfax stands on unceded traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. We recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and honor their sacrifices and hardships. We recognize that colonialism continues to affect modern Indigenous people. I've got a link that I'd like to share with you if at a later time you'd like to check to see where you are located in Indigenous communities that have occupied the lands in which you may be located at. So I'm going to drop that in the chat just so you have that available as well. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into our presentation. So I'd first like to share just kind of a little overview of what we're going to spend our time together doing. I know 2 hours seems like a really long time, but believe me, this will fly by quicker than you know it. But we're going to cover these specific things today. So first is basic terminology. Again, I mentioned you've got a workbook that has a more expansive list of terms, but I wanted to focus on some of the fundamental language and terminology. Talk about some best practices when interacting and socializing with the LGBTQ plus community. I wanted to share the coming out process. I think it's so important, and there's a lot of things that maybe our allies aren't aware of in that what that process entails. I'd like to share a bit about our history, and certainly we don't have enough time to cover all of it, but I've got quite a selection here that I'm excited to share with you. And then finally, how to be an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. Okay, so this is also in your workbook, but I'd like to cover some group norms while we're here together. So I will go through these real quickly. So the first one is just to be present. I am so grateful for your participation. I know it's a really busy time of year, so thank you very much for your participation. I just invite you to be as engaged as possible. If you have your phone, I just invite you to put it on mute. Thank you for muting yourselves. I certainly know as we go through the materials, if you need to step away, as Ryan mentioned earlier, please take care of your personal needs. We do invite you to come back, but just want you to be as engaged as you can for the time that we are together. The next one is, this is the right place to ask the wrong question. There are no dumb questions. This may be the first time you've ever had the opportunity to interact with this material. I've been doing this work for quite a while, and so I like to think that I'm pretty on top of questions that come, but I'd love for you to ask a question that is authentic to what you want to learn and what you want to know. Undoubtedly, if you're thinking it, someone else is as well. So I just invite you either in the chat or occasionally as we move into different sections, I'll want to check in and invite you to unmute if you have a question as well. The what stays and leaves rule, sometimes this could be called the Vegas rule. I just invite us to share. You may feel inclined. I'm inviting you to share about things that you've experienced or questions that you might have. That's what we want to stay here and remain within the construct of this time that we're together. But what we want to leave from this is really what we learn and the materials that we share, the activities and the general information. I hope that will leave, but what someone shares personally, we want that to stay here. Thinking about impact versus intent. The words and actions that we have can have meaning and have impacts on others around us. I just invite us that while we may have good intent, the impact may be different. If there's an opportunity for me in even asking a question, if I am able to, I may share a different way to ask the question or maybe another way to reframe it. I'd be remiss if at this time that we're together, if I didn't share some best practices in this process, but just being aware of the impact versus intent. Sharing the airtime. If you're a person who's really comfortable in social interaction, that is wonderful. I just want to make sure that we provide enough opportunity for folks who may be less inclined or not as comfortable engaging with this material. I just want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask questions. And finally, you have the right, you can reserve the right to change your mind. At some point during this time that we're together, you may say something and later disagree with yourself, and that's great. That's all right. That's perfectly natural. This is a safe space to say something and then later feel differently and change your mind. It's in fact encouraged. So I just invite you to reserve that right for yourself. Okay, I wanted to share this graph first. In addition to this being Pride Month, I wanted to share another reason why it's important, why I believe it's important to learn about the LGBTQ plus community. This is a recent Washington Post article that cited that 1 in 6 Gen Zers identify as LGBTQ plus. This data is meaningful when thinking about our future. Those Gen Zers will be getting into the workforce and seeking your services. It's important to recognize that a significant percentage of that population has an LGBTQ plus identity. The goal today is to provide tools and resources to be as inclusive to the LGBTQ plus community as possible. And so I think this is a fascinating graph. I mean, just looking to see the different generations. Of course, they list bisexual, gay, lesbian, transgender, and for other identities that may not be listed there. One thing I do want to note that while the Gen Zer population is significantly higher than some of the other generations, note that it's not to say that those identities aren't there with these older generations. It's just we're seeing more comfort, more understanding, more pride in identifying with using one of these categories. So it's not to say that there's just miraculously more folks that identify as LGBTQ plus, but we certainly see that this generation in particular understands, has the support, generally speaking, more support and resources and community to come out as their authentic selves. Okay, so we're going to dive into some of the language and terminology at this time. And again, they're in the workbook. I've got a really extensive list, but these are going to be some things I think that are fundamental for us all to be aware of. Okay, so let's start with sexual orientation. So this describes the emotional, romantic, or sexual attractions that we have towards another person. Perhaps this could be someone of the opposite gender, same gender, both genders, all genders, or no genders. And so we tend to think that this applies to just the LGBTQ plus community, but we all have a sexual orientation. So let me administer the first of our 2 polls. I want to pick your brain here. And I invite you to answer, at what point do you think we typically start to determine our sexual orientation? Might it be at birth, as a toddler, during adolescence or puberty, or as an adult? Give you a few seconds to reflect on that question. When do you think we start to kind of determine our sexual orientation? Give you a few more seconds. Okay, gonna go ahead and end that poll. Okay, so let me share the results. Hopefully you can see this. Actually, I'm seeing that the majority did say toddler. It's actually during adolescence or puberty. And so there's obviously a range of ages where adolescence and puberty apply, but generally this is really when we start to kind of figure out for ourselves where our attractions may lie. One thing I want to point out, that just because we feel a certain way during this point in our lives doesn't mean that that remains static for the remainder of our lives. We interact, connect with different people throughout our lives and may feel romantic or sexual attraction towards a different type of person than maybe how we felt during adolescence or puberty. I think it's just important to think that it's not abnormal to feel differently about people, and that our sexual attraction can be fluid throughout our lives. So let's talk about a few, and I'm not going to go into great detail with them, but I want to highlight a few things about each of these. So the first one about lesbian, oh, let me stop sharing that, sorry. Okay, so lesbian. So this obviously could be a woman who's emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to other women. Know that this term can be used for women as well as non-binary folks. But this is a term that not all women who have an attraction to other women feel comfortable using or use when referring to themselves. So lesbian has a very Eurocentric reference. And so someone who doesn't have a European identity may not like to use this term. So some women self-identify as being a gay woman. And so that's a great term to use as well. So know that lesbian isn't always used, and gay can certainly be used to identify, as you see here, men, women, or non-binary folks. And we'll talk about non-binary here in just a moment. Sometimes gay gets used as an umbrella term. I just want to point out that sometimes that can be exclusionary when we're talking about the overall community, because it certainly is more of a reference towards sexual orientation and does not include other identities. So just be aware, if you want to use more of an umbrella term, then maybe using the acronym could be helpful. And one thing I want to point out about the acronym, there's no wrong order in which you reference the identities, these identities. Sometimes the bisexual community will put the B in the front. Sometimes the transgender community might put the T in the front. So there's no wrong order to it. I want to point out bisexual. This describes a person who's experiencing emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attraction to more than one sex or gender, though not necessarily at the same time, in the same way, or the same degree. We tend to think that the bisexual community represents a very small percentage of the community when in fact they represent the largest. However, we make so many assumptions, inaccurate assessments about people based on who they may be in relationship with. And oftentimes that bisexual identity gets overlooked, there's a term called bi erasure, in which that identity is erased because of the assumptions that we make. If we see two men in a relationship, we may assume that that is a gay relationship, when in fact either or both of those individuals may identify as bisexual. Also, it may be a man and a woman in a relationship, and we assume that both of those folks identify as heterosexual, when in fact either or both of those individuals may identify as bisexual. So I just invite you to be aware in thinking about the assumptions that we make about people based on who they may be in relationship with. Got a few more terms, and then I'm going to jump over to the chat. So I wanted to introduce, if you may or may not have heard this term, pansexual. You may see the P in the letters when we're describing the community. This describes a person who experiences sexual, romantic, physical attraction for members of all genders, though not necessarily at the same time, the same level, or the same way. This is considered a newer, maybe more broadly used term that could describe a person who has an attraction to all genders. And so just making you aware of this term if you've not heard it before. You may see the letter A. This could stand for either asexual or aromantic. I'll start with asexual. This would describe a person who has either limited or lacking a sexual attraction towards another person. An abbreviated term might be ACE. Or aromantic. This could describe a person who either has limited or lacking romantic attraction towards another person, and an abbreviated term could be aro. You may see the letters or the description of same gender loving, or SGL. This can be used within some African American communities to describe a person who either identifies as homosexual or bisexual, and uncomfortable using those terms. You may see MSM for men having sex with men, or WSW for women having sex with women. I've also seen M4, the number 4, so M4M or W4W. So those could be used interchangeably. And then you're going to see this Q a couple times, but I want to first start with the context of sexual orientation. So this, first we'll start with queer. And I want to first state that this term has mixed reactions within our own community. So historically, this term has been used very negatively, has a lot of derogatory context. However, folks in our community have reclaimed that term. So some of our youth and young adults are reclaiming and using that term. This could be used to describe a person who doesn't fit or identify with society's expectation around gender or sexuality. I always say if a person self-identifies using the term queer, generally you could mirror that term with that person, but I would never assume that the entire community uses or utilizes that term. So it's always, if someone uses it personally, you could generally use it with that person. And then questioning. So particularly with the context of sexual orientation, this is for someone who's exploring kind of digging into having a better understanding about maybe feelings that they have as it relates to their sexual orientation. As we did the poll a little earlier, so during adolescence, puberty, we may come to one conclusion about what level of attraction we have towards a particular person or gender, but that may change over time, and that's perfectly natural. That's where this questioning might apply, and it can happen at any point in a person's life. Okay, so before I jump into the next section, I do want to look at some of these questions to make sure that we address them. I'm seeing this first time some of you have used pronouns. That's wonderful. I got a question. How do you respond to or help older folks who say, I just don't understand why we have to use these pronouns? So looking back at the pronouns, just again, we make assumptions about people, and we know that we all have different ways of expressing ourselves, and we can misinterpret how a person looks. And so just knowing what pronouns that person uses helps us when we're referring to that person to others. We certainly don't want to misgender someone or be disrespectful. So we just take the pressure off of having to guess how a person identifies and sharing our pronouns, and we take the pressure off of other people from assuming how we identify as well. And so I think based on the fact that it is relatively new, it will become more and more common, not just in our professional lives, but certainly in our personal interactions as well. And it has such a meaningful impact, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. For folks who go into every interaction being misgendered, being misunderstood or misidentified, and so it can have such an impact in demonstrating your sense of inclusivity and the fact that you are willing to share your own pronouns and invite others to do the same. So it's one of those things, I think, as we become more and more familiar with doing it and understanding the impacts, then it'll be easier for us to do this on an ongoing basis. But I understand and recognize that it seems relatively new to some folks. WLW or MLM, absolutely, for either women loving women or men loving men, and not to be confused with multi-level marketing. Absolutely, yeah, not multi-level marketing in that instance. Thank you for clarifying on that one. So wonderful. Yeah, I think just the more we do these things, the more we understand these different identities, I think and again, thinking about that stat that we looked at earlier, the number of Gen Zers that are identifying as LGBTQ+, whether you know it or not, someone in your presence, most likely, statistically speaking, may be identifying as LGBTQ+. Okay, so let me transition over to another set of terms. So I want to talk about gender identity now. So again, the definition here describes the internal sense of one's own gender, that internalization about how we see ourselves, maybe as male, female, both, maybe neither. This may correlate with a person's biological sex that's assigned at birth, or it could be different. And this is something that's not visible to others. We often conflate this term with biological sex, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But guess what? I've got another poll, as you probably guessed. So let me administer it real quick. Okay, at what point do you think people start to typically determine their own gender identity? At birth, as a toddler, during adolescence or puberty, or as an adult? When do you think we start to kind of figure out our own gender identity? Give you a few seconds. Give you a few more seconds. Okay. Great response. So I'll go ahead and share for the sake of time. I'll go ahead and share the poll with you. And the majority of you got it right. So as a toddler is really when we start to kind of figure that out. Now, let me assure you, that's not one of the first words we say. It's not mama, dada, gender identity, but we kind of understand because there's a lot of things going on at that point in our lives. Think about this, maybe the interacting with other children at this point. There's a curiosity maybe about our own anatomy, maybe our caregivers, our parents, about our personal anatomy. A lot of our toys and role play and clothing and everything has been gendered up to this point. And so some children are right on board and they identify with the gender in which they're perceived as being, and some children don't. They don't see themselves as the little boy or the little girl that they are being perceived as, and they are able to articulate this. That's another thing, is we can communicate more effectively at this point in our lives. And so, and we'll go through a couple of the terms. So for that small child whose internalization about their gender is out of alignment or incongruent with the biological sex they were assigned at birth, that would represent a person who's perhaps transgender. And so this would be a person whose either gender identity and or expression differs from cultural expectations based on the sex that was assigned them at birth. We have more resources, more support for transgender children. This is not a new phenomenon by any shape, way, or any stretch of the imagination. This is throughout time and throughout history, we have seen this community thriving. And so it's not something just at this point in history in this part of the world. It's across the globe and throughout time. We have seen variations in how a person identifies that doesn't necessarily align with the biological sex that was assigned at birth. For someone whose internalization of their gender does align or does match their biological sex that was assigned at birth, the term would be cisgender. These are Latin terms, cis meaning on the side of, and trans meaning to cross over. And so again, as a toddler, we're starting to kind of come to understand how we see ourselves. And these are some of the terms. Another one, and I mentioned this a little earlier during our sexual orientation slides, but gender non-binary. So this describes a spectrum of gender identities that are not necessarily exclusively masculine or feminine, identities that are outside the gender binary. So we've been conditioned to think about gender strictly as male or female, and what we know to be true is that we have to break that binary construct and know that some people see themselves identify outside of that binary, maybe a combination of both, maybe neither. And so I do want to point out that this identity may fall under the transgender umbrella, but doesn't necessarily for all folks. And so a person who may see themselves as non-binary may or may not identify as well as being transgender. So just know that. Let's get into a few more terms. So I've got another slide here to cover some other gender identity terms I want you to be aware of. Genderqueer. So this could be a descriptor for a person's gender identity label for a person who does not fit either the binary of male or female, man or woman. Consider this as an umbrella term for many gender diverse, non-conforming, or non-binary identities. I always say if someone self-identifies using this term, you can generally use that for that person. It's just really, it depends on how that person self-identifies. Two-spirit. So this is a modern pan-Indian umbrella term that can be used within some indigenous North American cultures, tribes, to describe a person fulfilling either a third gender or another gender variant role. This is considered in many cultures to be ceremonious and highly regarded. Not to say that's within all tribes, but there are many North American tribes that do recognize two-spirit identities. This is a term you wouldn't use if you don't have an indigenous or native identity. But it is, we're seeing a resurgence of the two-spirit community, which is very exciting. And then you've got the Q again. So I wanted to share that. We talked about queer. So again, that's for someone who doesn't fit society's expectation or gender or sexuality or gender identity. And then questioning in this instance, this would be a person who's questioning their gender identity. Just because we come to understand where a gender identity lies during a toddler timeframe, we may not have the support or resources at that point. And so a lot of folks have to come to that understanding and support later in life. And so that's where that questioning might apply towards one's own gender identity. Oh, let me stop sharing that poll. Sorry. Okay, so I want to go through just a few more terms. And again, these are just some of the basics, and we've got a lot more robust list in the workbook. But I want to talk about gender expression. So we talked about gender identity a little earlier, that internalization about how we see ourselves. Think about gender expression as how we present our gender to the world. This is a public display demonstration of how we see ourselves and how we want to present our gender to others. And this can be through a variety of different ways. This could be through our behavior, our clothing, hairstyle, facial hair, body characteristics, makeup, and so many other varying ways. I tend to think this is the most fluid in that we may present ourselves one way professionally and completely another in our private lives. There are circumstances in which a person may not feel safe or comfortable presenting their authentic gender expression to others based on fear of violence, harassment, discrimination, and know that it's something that we want to make sure that we are aware of. And again, when we talk about pronouns, we're basing it on, we're seeing someone's gender expression and making an assumption, making an assessment about how that person would identify. And sometimes that may be inaccurate. And so I think it's important just to be aware that this is where we typically can make the most mistakes. We all have a gender expression. We all have a very unique, different way in which we want to present our gender to others. And so just being aware that it's something that we all possess and no two are necessarily exactly alike. Gender diverse, you may hear this term, or gender diversity. Think of this as an umbrella term that can be used to describe an array of different labels or terms that people may use to apply to their gender identity expression, or even the perceptions that don't conform with society's expectations, norms, or I already said expectations, but other roles. Biological sex. So I talk about this in the way that this gets conflated sometimes with our gender identity. Sometimes the biological sex that we're assigned at birth, and that's obviously when we're born, someone makes a visual assessment typically about our external genitalia. But this really is more of a medical term that can get to the chromosomal, hormonal, or anatomical characteristics. We've tend to think about this in a binary context of male or female, boy, girl, but there's three categories. Intersex is a third characterization that can be used to identify, as you see the description here, several different variations in sex characteristics at chromosomal, hormonal, external genitalia, and other characteristics as well. There are about 2% of the population that identify as intersex. So it's a significant population. It's roughly the same percentage of people that identify as redheads. And so this is, again, throughout time and throughout history, we've had intersex children that were born. There's an outdated and very stigmatizing term, hermaphrodite, that is used. That is an appropriate term for some plants and animals that can reproduce independently, but it's an inaccurate and a very stigmatizing term for people. Okay, any questions before we move into, actually, I just have a little activity after this, but I wanted to check in with the terms that we've covered thus far, and make sure that the descriptions make sense to you. I like the abbreviated term of NB can be used for non-binary as well, either spelled out as ENBY or the letters NB for non-binary. So I'm glad, thank you for sharing that in the chat as well. Excellent. So I have an activity that's in the workbook as well. I just wanted to kind of go through it with you, if you'll indulge me for just a second. I'm a very visual person, so I just kind of like to tie in what we've discussed with a fun little activity. So this is called the genderbread person. And we use this activity in all sorts of different settings. It's also been used in schools, certainly in corporate settings. So, but I think it really kind of ties some of the things we've just talked about. What I find fascinating is that they have, of course, gender identity, what we talked about, gender expression. They use the term anatomical sex, which can be used interchangeably with biological sex, but either of those terms can be used. And then they separate, they break out sexual orientation to include exactly what the definition states, the either sexually attracted as well as romantically attracted. Sometimes those line up. Sometimes we have the same romantic attraction to the same type of people that we have a sexual attraction to. Maybe they differ, maybe they vary. And so this activity just happens to separate those out, break those out. And so let's start over on the left-hand side. So I am interested if you were a fast typer or if somebody wants to unmute, but I'm interested in what you think this first term might be for this genderbread person. So I'm kind of circling up here at the top. What term do you think would apply to this particular part of the genderbread person? Gender identity, I see that. Brain as well, but yes, so that internalization about how we see ourselves. So thank you very much. I'm going to jump over to the side here. What term might apply to the exterior, I'm using a couple of little hints here, of the genderbread person? We talked a little bit about this earlier. What do you think would be the appropriate term? Gender expression, yes. Yes, so that is actually that outward presentation about ourselves would be a gender expression. So that outline would be the term applied. So I'm going to jump up here to the heart. What term do you think would apply to the genderbread person, this particular area? There are a couple options. Yeah, sexual attraction, romantic attraction, all of those terms could be used to describe. Well done. And so finally, let's talk about this part of the genderbread person. What do you think the term would be for this aspect of the genderbread person? Yeah, they say anatomical, and this activity could be biological or anatomical. So well done, everyone. Ding, 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 ding. So let me just jump over. I'm not going to get into great detail with this. It's an activity in the workbook that I invite you to check out. But what I find fascinating with this version of the activity is that they've understood the earlier versions had a spectrum. And so one side might be male, the other side might be female, masculine, feminine. And so you had to go through on this spectrum and decide whether, where your identity, where you personally see yourself lies on this line. What they've done in this newer enhanced version is that they've understood that some people may have characteristics of both, maybe neither. And so as you can see here, on the left side of the bar, it's a 0 with a line through it. This just indicates a lacking of. And so we may, when thinking about our gender identity, we may identify with, and they use fancy terms like womanness, manness, as aren't necessarily the exact terms, but they give you the idea. But you may see feminine aspects, masculine aspects of either or both or neither of these. And so I would just invite you on your own just to kind of see where you identify yourself as it relates to both gender identity. The same with gender expression. You may have some aspects of both, maybe neither. And if it's neither, you would probably be on the left end of the line. They break this out for anatomical sex. They do it down here as well for sexually attracted to. I don't know if you can see women, and they've got feminine, female people. They use a couple of different ways to describe. It may be some of both, maybe neither, maybe exclusively one and not the other. And so I just invite you on your own just to take advantage of this activity. I think it's an interesting way just to kind of reflect on how you identify yourself. They do have on the side here sex assigned at birth. And so you have the 3 choices that we talked about earlier: female, male, and intersex. I love this middle section here where they talk about your identity does not equal your expression, which does not equal your sex. And your gender identity is not equal to your sexual orientation. These are all unique of one another. They may have an influence on, but they should be considered separate from one another. We often conflate these terms and maybe misassociate some. real easy way to maybe the correlation between sexual orientation and gender identity might be, think about your gender identity as who you are, and think about your sexual orientation as who you love. Let me drop in the chat, and I'll do this in a little bit, the workbook, just in case you didn't get a copy of it. I know I'm making several references to it. So I will go ahead and grab that real quick for you. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm just going to drop it in without much of an explanation, but this is the workbook. It's in Dropbox. That's really the only way I found that I could send it out to everyone, so you don't have to sign up to it, but it's hopefully an easy way just for you to access it. And I can send it as an attachment after the training. But if you'd like to take a look at this while we're going, I invite you to do so. Okay, so hopefully you enjoy this activity. I think it's a great way just to kind of summarize some of the terms that we talked about earlier. Okay, I want to share a term with you called heteronormativity. And so if you'll indulge me, let me read the definition. This is the assumption that everyone is heterosexual and that heterosexuality is superior to all other sexualities. This leads to the invisibility and stigmatizing of other sexualities. Often included is this concept, a level of gender normativity and gender roles. The assumption that individuals should identify as men or women, be masculine men or feminine women, and that men and women are a complementary pair. I share this with you because this may be maybe a term that you haven't heard of, but I have no doubt that you've maybe perhaps thought about the way that this is woven or kind of baked into our society and our culture, and just that we assume that everyone is heterosexual. I would even introduce a term of cisnormativity, so the assumption that everyone's cisgender. And perhaps maybe that cisgender, being cisgender, is superior to all other gender identities. We'll talk a little bit about the concept of coming out. And really, this is based on the premise that we assume everyone's heterosexual and cisgender. And so if we didn't assume that, or have the expectations that everyone, that everyone was not heterosexual or cisgender, then we really wouldn't have to have the need to say, to come out and share an identity that differs from that expectation or the assumption. I'll give a few examples of how this plays out into just a regular day-to-day life. We might see someone with a wedding ring. It might be a woman, and we assume, if we feel so inclined to ask, oh, I see that you're married. Tell me about your husband. That's an example of heteronormativity, the assumption that it's a heterosexual woman in a heterosexual relationship. If we see a man with a child, and we may just be so inclined to ask, oh, I see you've got, what a cute kid. Where's mommy? Is she around somewhere? I mean, that's kind of bold in doing that, but that's an example of thinking that that's a heterosexual person in a heterosexual relationship. And so these are just some very elementary, simple ways that can be applied on a regular basis. And I just invite you to think about this concept and think about just how frequently it comes into play, whether you know this term or not, and being open to the understanding that there are, again, thinking about that Gen Zer graph, that significant population don't identify as heterosexual and or cisgender. And so just being aware of that and not making assumptions. I'll pause for a second. Are there any questions? I'm watching the chat, or if any thoughts or questions about this term? Is it something that you've thought about or heard about before? That's okay. Yeah, not hearing it, that's okay. Again, we sometimes don't have to think about it, especially if you do have a heterosexual and cisgender identity. But I know certainly you're with an awareness about the LGBTQ plus community, you might see where this concept may be applied. And I want to say, as a part of the LGBTQ plus community, that I've struggled with this, being, certainly in the way that I've thought about the world and navigated through the world, and understand it to be something that I have to overcome, even as being part of the community. There's, being internalized homophobia, maybe internalize, transphobia for folks who are, struggle with their identity. They've seen, such significance in our, in our communities and our population where there have been, negative perceptions about these identities. And so even folks in the community kind of, have maybe at one time or another struggled with this concept and having to overcome society's expectations. And yes, I see certainly it could be correlated as well in the context of white supremacy, certainly having an impact and seeing one identity as being superior to others. And so I just invite us just to be aware of this and just thinking about our interactions, maybe asking, I'll have some examples later, but thinking more broadly, asking open-ended questions and not making assumptions about people, who they love, who they are, and being prepared for any type of response. If you're going to open yourself up to knowing that there are other identities, then being prepared that someone may respond with those other identities. And so just, I think hopefully having a familiarity with those will be helpful. Seeing great thoughts in the chat. So thank you very, very much. And I appreciate your thoughts. Okay, I have a video that I would like to share with you. I just need to make sure that I set the audio up well so you can hear it. Okay.
The first time you ask someone what pronouns they use, it may feel awkward. You may even be worried that you'll offend the person. But assuming someone's gender and getting it wrong could actually be more offensive. This is called misgendering. If you happen to misgender someone, acknowledge your mistake, but be aware that over-apologizing can just make things more uncomfortable. Just say you're sorry and move on. As with anything else, practice makes perfect, so let's walk through some examples to make it less intimidating. Here we are at the local library. Here we are at the local library with Brian and Star. Brian greets Star at the book club meeting.
Hi, my name is Brian. I use the pronouns he and him. How about you?
What's great about this scenario is that Brian shares his own pronouns before he asks for Star's. This breaks the ice and makes the exchange conversational rather than one-sided. Sometimes, you might be mid-conversation and realize that you never asked for the person's pronouns. It's not too late. If that were to happen, Brian might say,
Star, I just realized I never asked what pronouns you use.
Asking about pronouns is becoming more common, but not everyone is used to doing it. Putting pronouns into practice sometimes involves managing reactions. If Star responds with,
Why are you asking me this? Isn't it clear?
Brian might say,
I ask everyone this question because I want to be respectful and not make any assumptions.
If Star is like,
Pronouns? What do you mean?
Brian might respond,
I mean, do you use the pronouns he, him, she, her, they, them, or something else?
Keep in mind, singling people out can make them feel uncomfortable, so if you're in a group setting, you'll want to ask everyone what pronouns they use, not just the people you're unsure about. Be sure to share your pronouns as well. Whether you realize it or not, by doing this on a regular basis, you're changing the culture around you.
I like this video because it does demonstrate, obviously we talked about some of these things a little earlier, but it kind of demonstrates some examples in ways in which you might navigate through a conversation. There's no wrong time to share your own pronouns, or if you realize that you didn't invite someone else to share theirs as well. So there's never a bad time. Doesn't have to be at the very beginning. Ideally, that might be an opportune time to do it, but that's not to say that you can't invite someone at a later time if you're not sure. And certainly you wouldn't want to pick and choose who you'd be asking this. If you're going to do it, just start doing it consistently, because that one person that you maybe seek out to verify may feel kind of individualized, or may feel like you're kind of just picking at them alone. And so you just want to start doing it on a regular basis for everyone, so that person doesn't feel pressured or isolated in that exchange. So any last thoughts, questions? Does it kind of, obviously seeing the video this time, does it give maybe a different context as well? And sharing your name. So obviously, if you don't want to share your pronouns, that's okay. You don't have to. But if someone doesn't, we would probably want to just use that person's name when we're referring to them. And that's absolutely fine. There may be a lot of different reasons why someone may be reluctant to share their pronouns. And so it's never something that should be mandatory. And certainly if someone doesn't want to share their pronouns, then you could always use their name, and that's just fine. And someone could use multiple pronouns as well. So they may use he, him, and they, them pronouns, or other variations of pronouns. And so in that instance, what you would do is refer to that person interchangeably with the different pronouns. And so if there are multiples, you could maybe the first time use one pronoun and then maybe another pronoun that they identify with later on in making a reference to that person. So that's another option that can be utilized as well. Okay, so let me go into, oops, we don't need to watch that again. Okay, so 10 things that you're actually saying when you ignore someone's pronouns. So let me just make sure and differentiate between making a mistake, which we all make mistakes. I make mistakes each and every day. I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, so we all make mistakes. As I mentioned earlier, acknowledge it, apologize, and move on. We don't need to sit and stew in that, but we want to acknowledge it, apologize, and move on. But what this slide is indicating is if you just refuse to acknowledge, just ignoring or being intentional about being disrespectful about someone's pronouns. So I'll read these to you briefly, real quick here. I know you better than you know yourself. I'd rather hurt you repeatedly than change the way that I speak about you. Your sense of safety is not important to me. Your identity isn't real and should not be acknowledged. I want to teach everyone around me to disrespect you. Offending you is fine if it makes me feel more comfortable. I can hear you talking, but I'm not really listening. Being who you truly are is an inconvenience to me. I'd prefer it if you'd stop being honest with me. And finally, I'm not an ally, a friend, or someone you can trust. I think these are pretty powerful on their own, but thinking about these collectively, the impact that we can have on being disrespectful, misgendering someone. There are a few impacts that I wanted to share. Higher rates of stress, anxiety, depression, disengagement, and thinking about what that might look like. Decreased participation in activities, meetings, projects, attendance, possibly a departure from an organization altogether, and in extreme cases, suicidal thoughts and actions. Any questions? Oh, one last thing I do want to point out. Sorry, I know I framed it for a question, but I do want to share, and I'm not an attorney, but I do want to be, as we're thinking about employment laws and protections that we have, being intentional, disrespectful by misgendering someone intentionally or ignoring someone's pronouns, calling them by the wrong name, are forms of harassment. And so, you know, we all make mistakes, that's one thing, but then being intentional and being hurtful and disrespecting someone is a form of harassment, and there are repercussions that apply with that. So I just invite you to be thoughtful about this, thinking about the impacts when you know, or maybe with someone who just refuses to acknowledge someone's pronouns, and just these are some of the impacts, the messaging that's being received. Okay. I'm appreciating the engagement in the chat, so please keep it coming. And if you have a question, I'm happy to address, and I've got Ryan to help me as well. I'd like to share with you now what I consider some best practices, and this by no means covers everything, but I want to give you some fundamentals. If nothing else, when you leave today, and this is certainly in the workbook as well, I just want you to be, you know, to remember maybe these things in particular. I talked about this a little earlier, but I would certainly encourage avoid saying hermaphrodite. We talked a little about this earlier. Instead, we would use the term intersex. And the reason for this is that hermaphrodite is a stigmatizing, inaccurate word with a negative medical history. An example might be, what are the best practices for the medical care of intersex patients? And so just giving construct of a sentence, the intersex would be used as an adjective or descriptor. And so we just would use it in that. We wouldn't say an intersex. We would say an intersex person, the intersex community, and so forth. Avoid saying homosexual, and instead maybe gay and or lesbian. And the reason for this, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a homosexual often connotes a medical diagnosis or can be discomfort with gay and lesbian people. An example here might be, we want to do a better job of being supportive of our gay and lesbian colleagues. Avoid saying born female or born male. Avoid female-bodied or male-bodied language. And instead we would say assigned female or assigned male at birth. And the reason for this is that assigned language accurately depicts a situation that occurs at birth. Again, we're born and someone makes an assessment and they assign that to us at birth. And then bodied language can often be interpreted as pressure to medically transition or an invalidation of one's gender identity. Again, when someone's transitioning, that's a very private matter. And so there may be a lot of different ways in which that person's journey may play out. It might be simply changing a person's name and pronouns. It might be pursuing hormonal replacement therapy. It might be pursuing gender affirming surgery. That is something that that individual decides for themselves. And so we certainly, it's none of our business. And so just being intentional and thoughtful about when someone shares their identity, perhaps as being transgender, it's really, too often it becomes open where folks feel inclined to ask a lot of medical questions that you really wouldn't feel comfortable or certainly don't feel privileged to have to share your medical identity or history. So here's an example. Max was assigned female at birth, then transitioned in college. Finally on this slide, avoid saying a gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. Or using the past tense word of transgendered. I've heard someone talking, oh, that they're transgendered or cisgendered. It's not a noun or a verb. It's actually an adjective. So we were talking about a gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender person. And so we use this as a descriptor. And so an example here, we have a transgender executive leading our organization. So being focused. Yeah, this is focused on pronouns in the workplace. I see that we've got some examples that are shared there as well. So good. Thank you for putting that in the chat, Ryan. Yeah, so just being aware, I've heard oftentimes a gay or a transgender, it's like, that's not it. It's like, it's a gay person or a gay community, transgender person, what have you. So just a few, got a couple more I want to share as well. Avoid saying transgender people and normal people. Instead, we would say transgender people and cisgender people. And the reason, normal implies abnormal, which is stigmatizing way to refer to a person. So an example here, this group is open to both transgender and cisgender people. Avoid saying both genders or opposite sexes. Instead, we would just say all genders. And the reason is that both implies that there are only two. And opposites can reinforce an antagonism amongst genders. So the example, video games aren't just a boy thing, people of all genders play them. Avoid saying ladies and gentlemen, or guys. I've been in so many meetings where, you know, it may be a room full of women and we're still hearing, hey guys, how's it going? And so instead, we would say everyone, folks, honored guests, you all. I'm from Texas. I can put a draw on it like nobody's business. But, you know, just finding more inclusive language when we're referring to a group and moving away from that binary. And so here's an example. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Avoid saying mailman, fireman, policeman, congressman, chairman. I've got a couple extras there. Instead, we would say mail clerk, firefighter, police officer, congressperson, chairperson. I heard an example, instead of mankind, humankind. So just thinking of more inclusive terms that can be used because people of all gender do these things. In the example here, I just saw a firefighter rescue a person from a burning car. Avoid saying it when we're referring to someone, particularly when we don't know their pronouns. I always encourage starting out with they, them, their if you haven't had a chance to meet someone yet. So if you see someone, you're like, oh, I don't know them. I haven't met, I don't know what they do. And then obviously the ideal thing would be getting to introduce yourself and get to know that person. But it refers to an inanimate object or not really how we should be referring to people. Finally, avoid saying sexual preference, maybe gender preference. I don't know if I've heard that one is common, or lifestyle. What we're really referring to is either someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And the reason is a person's sexuality or gender is not a choice or a hobby. There certainly are lifestyles. If you like to go hiking or you're athletic, that's a lifestyle. If you follow the Broncos or other sporting teams, that's a lifestyle. But really, our sexuality or gender is not a lifestyle. And so the example here, I feel honored that Steve shared his sexual orientation with me, not his sexual preference. So we would say sexual orientation in that example. Are there others? I'm maybe a couple here I'm seeing in the chat, but are there other things that you've thought about? It may be like, I wonder. This doesn't cover everything. So I think these are hopefully some of the highlights that you may have heard. Yeah, the abbreviation of trans instead of transgender. I don't know if that's the thing. Hearing some discussions with trans women versus trans women with the separation. I've seen the asterisk used because there's an array of different identities under, think about transgender maybe used as an umbrella term. And so you might see that as well. And really it's just how a person self-identifies and how they may express that either in the abbreviated term trans or transgender. And so it really kind of depends on the individual and how they choose to identify themselves. Any last thoughts before we move into the next segment? Okay, so I want to share coming out of the closet. And the reason is often when we talk about coming out, it's as though it may seem that it's a one-time occurrence. However, for most folks, coming out is a series of decisions, sometimes daily, that LGBTQ plus people must navigate in every new situation that they enter. People may be out in some spaces and in others. A decision to come out is to a person or a group is one of comfort, safety, trust, and readiness. It's dangerous, unhealthy, and certainly unhelpful to force someone to come out or to out someone else without any regard to that person's identity, regardless of their identity. So, I think a lot of times our allies think about this is just, you do it once and bada bing, bada boom, it's everybody knows. And really it's something that we have to decide. Certainly I can speak for myself in the situations, social situations, thinking about that term we spoke of earlier of that heteronormativity and the assumption that everyone assumes that you're heterosexual or assume that everyone's cisgender. And so being aware of that. And so this certainly is the process by which someone accepts and identifies with their gender identity and or sexual orientation, and then shares that identity willingly with others. And so I wanted to share just a few of these do's and don'ts. That doesn't cover everything, but just some of the fundamentals. Do know that this is a sign of trust. Don't say I always knew or downplay the significance about someone sharing this with you. Do check in on how confidential this is. Don't go tell everyone bragging about your new trans or gay friends. So obviously there's a lot of safety involved. And so I think it's an important question when someone does come out to you. It's like, thank you. I'm so grateful. Is there anything I can do to support you? Is it, who knows, is this something that you want to keep confidential? Is there any support I can offer in maybe sharing if it's family members, etc.? It's appropriate to ask that person, but not assume. And so it's appropriate to ask. Do remember that their gender identity or sexuality is just one dimension of who they are. Don't forget that they're still the same person that you knew, befriended, or loved before. Do show interest and curiosity about this new part of them that they're sharing with you. Don't ask probing questions or cross personal boundaries that you would not have crossed earlier. Again, I've mentioned this before, too often when someone comes out, someone may feel so inclined just to ask a lot of intrusive questions about medical history, about a lot of things. If it's something that you wouldn't normally discuss, then by no means in sharing this identity information about your identity, would it mean that you have free reign to ask a lot of probing questions? And on the flip side, I will say that it's certainly, if someone's oversharing, then you have the right to say, if they feel inclined to share too much information, you have the right just to, to say, I appreciate it, but that's maybe a bit more than I need to know. And so it's a two-sided coin. So I just wanted to make sure to make you aware of that. Do ask them how best you can support them. And finally, don't assume that you knew why they came out to you. So again, just being a supportive listener, and do, follow the lead of that person that shares this new identity about themselves with you. I think I'm seeing in the chat. So if there's, with young people, it's, obviously there's a lot to be considered versus a person, someone who's older adult who may be out on their own. Obviously, the ideal thing would be to share resources with the family. I always say, if a person's coming out, it's the whole family may be coming out. If a team member is coming out in the workplace, the whole team's kind of coming out in support, hopefully, of that individual. And so just making sure that resources are known for maybe the parents or caregivers. That might be through PFLAG. I've got a lot of different resources in the workbook that are available. The center, certainly, and there's other wonderful LGBT organizations that can be of support as well. But not only do you want to support that individual, but you also want to provide resources for those folks that want to be allies or want to learn more, but maybe just don't have the resources to support themselves. And I'm seeing that the reference to that folks with the X, we certainly are seeing that being used as well sometimes for certain groups that can use the X to show there may be gendered language. And so using the X may be showing more inclusion and a non-binary reference to either folks, or we've seen maybe the Latinx community. And so those are just a few examples, and I'm grateful that they're being shared in the chat with you now. Okay, so I want to share some of our history with you, because as a person who's part of the community, I didn't learn a lot about this in school. And we've got October now is LGBTQ plus History Month, and certainly throughout Pride, we want to share and celebrate some of our accomplishments, but we're certainly got a lot of history, both good and bad. And so I want to share, just give you kind of a glimpse of some of the history. And I'll start with trauma. I get into some discrimination, and then I always like to end on a high note with our achievements. And so first, let me start with some of the traumas that we've seen. So I'll start with 1945. And so this was homosexuals remained interned in Nazi concentration camps after liberation by the Allied forces. You can see that black and white picture with a pink triangle. That was a designation for homosexuals in concentration camps. So not only were Jewish people detained and persecuted in concentration camps, but based on a German criminal code, paragraph 175, that declared homosexual relationships between males to be illegal, and among acts such as underage abuse and bestiality. So even after the Jewish people were liberated from the camps, these homosexuals remained in internment and were moved around different locations and continued persecution and violence. In 1952, homosexuality is classified as a personality disorder in the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So a person could be identified as being LGBTQ and institutionalized at that time. In 1953, there was an executive order signed into law that the government impacting employees that were considered sexual perversion and other immoral acts. This, while it did not explicitly list homosexuality, thousands of federal employees lost their jobs. 1966, the Compton cafeteria riots. We tend to think about Stonewall, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in 1966, on the West Coast, in the Tenderloin district at the Gene Compton cafeteria, there was a riot that occurred based on police violence against transgender and drag people at this restaurant. And so When we think about the trans movement, really the Compton cafeteria riots was really the start of that, and that occurred in San Francisco. 1969, in the early hours of June 28th, 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn. And while raids were not uncommon, this was the first time that the patrons fought back and considered the modern day LGBTQ movement by some. There are two individuals that I wanted to highlight. Two trans women of color, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, that are recognized as being instigators or highly involved in the Stonewall Rebellion, and certainly advocating and fighting for LGBTQ rights at that time. When we think about our history, we need to recognize the rich beauty and diversity that the LGBTQ plus community represents. We're not monolithic. We have different races, nationalities, ability status, ages, genders, sexualities, and so many other beautiful factors. And so, but the Stonewall Rebellion is considered kind of, when we celebrate in June, it's really kind of based on the Stonewall Rebellion. 1999, this Transgender Day of Remembrance, or TDOR, was founded by Gwendolyn Smith. This was a transgender woman who wanted to memorialize the murder of her friend, Rita Hester, in Massachusetts. It has evolved into an international day of action, occurring annually on or around November 20th, calling for action and recognition of transgender people and non-binary folks that are victims of violence, of murder, and in so many different aspects. Predominantly Black and Latinx trans women are the highest impact, have the highest rates of violence. In the United States, we have at least 25 so far reported cases of murder against transgender and non-binary people. And that's just reported. We anticipate this may be the highest year with the highest rate of murder and violence against transgender people. So some forms of discrimination. In 1916, there was a ban introduced in the military through the revisions of the Article of War, which thousands of service members, active service members, were disarmably discharged based on this. Jump to 1982, there's a term called GRID, which was initially gay-related immune deficiency, later known as AIDS. This was a lethal virus noticed that spread through the gay community, first reported as in the New York Times as a rare pneumonia and skin cancer, and certainly through the CDC. It was considered gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. Gay loved ones were denied access to be with their partners and friends and loved ones as they were dying in isolation within hospitals. Oftentimes, families who disowned their gay sons would come in at the last minute, maybe in the hospital, and revoke the access for their friends and their loved ones. In 1992, Colorado passed Amendment 2. This denied LGB folks with some protections that were already in place for anti-discrimination protections. In 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was instituted in the military. This impacted hundreds of thousands of active service members. The premise of not disclosing, but not being able to be your authentic self as well. And so it had a significant impact on the service members that tried to be their authentic self in the active duty. DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, in 1996 was passed. This prevented the government from recognizing same-sex marriages. In 2008, California passed Proposition 8, making same-sex marriages illegal. It previously was illegal in California, and then this was passed in 2008. 2019, there was a president issued a transgender ban on active service members. This impacted well over 10,000 active transgender service members being prevented from active duty. 2020, there was the transgender healthcare. The administration ruled to remove non-discrimination protections for transgender people when it came to healthcare and health insurance. And most recently, we've seen this year several states that are pushing anti-transgender legislation with a notable emphasis on restricting transgender student athletes from participating in sports that align with their gender identity. I like to end on a high note, so let's talk about some achievements. So as early as 1958, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay rights, LGBT rights. And so there was a publication called One. This was a gay publication that the post office refused to distribute. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the publication, and so that they had to, the post office had to distribute that. In 1962, Illinois became the first state to decriminalize homosexual acts between two consenting adults. I talked a little bit about this earlier, but in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association no longer deemed homosexuality as a mental disorder or mental illness. In 1994, the American Medical Association followed suit. I'm going to date myself, but I remember 1997 when Ellen DeGeneres came out. She was one of the most public figures at the time to come out as a lesbian. So there's obviously some negative impacts, but she has overcome those most definitely. 2009, the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crimes Act. Both Matthew Shepard and this expanded, first I'll start there, hate crime laws to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Both Matthew Shepard and James Byrd were tragically murdered both in 1998, and the families came together to push this legislation to include sexual orientation and gender identity in hate crime laws. Just a few more. So 2011, this was the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. 2013, the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act, as well as the first time that the LGBTQ plus community was acknowledged in a State of the Union address. 2014, Israel unveiled a memorial honoring the LGBTQ people that were persecuted by Nazis during World War II. 2015, as you may recall, was the Supreme Court ruled in favor of recognizing same-sex marriage across the country. A lot of folks don't realize that in majority of states that they did not recognize same-sex marriages, and so this elevated it so that it was recognized across the country. People also don't realize that you could be fired for being gay by coming out. So you may get married on the weekend and post your wedding pictures on social media, and your employer in a majority of states could still fire you, but that at least recognizing same-sex marriage. 2018, some say that Colorado went from the hate state to the great state in that we elected our first openly gay governor, which is of course Jared Polis. 2020, the Supreme Court, this last year, you may recall when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of expanding workplace protections. Sex was always considered a protected class, protected identity, and they expanded it to recognize gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender expression. And most recently, we're seeing that despite the anti-transgender legislation being pushed within many states, that the federal government has passed several LGBTQ plus affirming legislative measures and committing to pass what's called the Equality Act. And so this expands protections for LGBTQ plus folks. It's already been approved, voted in through the House of Representatives, and just needs to be voted on. And the president has deemed that he would sign that into law, but that's the Equality Act. Okay, that's a lot of history. I covered quite a bit. Just want to check in. I'll look at the chat as well. Again, being part of the community, that a lot of this I did not know. And so to assume that our allies would know about this as well, or even other parts of the folks in the community, hopefully it gives you some perspective. Okay, let's share ways to be an ally. And of course, we've got some Q&A time built into this as well. And that would be a wonderful time that we can turn the presentation off and get to see each other and verbalize some of your questions you might have. First and foremost, I like to consider this allyship basics, or 101. Oops. First, you're not expected to be an expert and know everything about the LGBTQ plus community. No one's perfect, and we're all bound to make mistakes. As I said, I make mistakes every single day. The best thing to do is simply acknowledge, apologize, and move on. I do want to preface that not only do we hope that our allies will be heterosexual cisgender people, we need to be allies of each other. So people in the LGBTQ plus community need to be allies of other people in the LGBTQ plus community. I happen to be white, cisgender, and gay. I need to be an ally of people of different races, different sexual orientations, different gender identities, different ability statuses, different ages. And so it's not something that others need to exclusively be allyship for. We need to be allies of each other. You are expected, however, to take the initiative to learn about, in this instance, the LGBTQ plus community. Don't expect that your LGBTQ friend or family member, maybe they're not necessarily assigned a subject matter expert on all things about the LGBTQ plus community. We're rich, diverse, we're not monolithic. And so there's a lot to learn. And there's a lot of wonderful resources, the internet. I'll talk about some TED Talks, and there's a lot of other ways that you can source great information without having to utilize that person and having them share everything about the community. Be supportive and listen. Again, we talked a little earlier about when someone comes out to you, they're sharing that personal part about themselves to you, they trust you. And so hopefully in learning about this, just being supportive and listening is a wonderful way to be an ally. Know that each person, as I mentioned a little earlier, has a unique, different experience as part of the community. So don't assume to know exactly what that person's experience or identity is about. Don't make assumptions, ask open-ended questions, but certainly don't dig and ask things that wouldn't normally be appropriate either. I've got a few things I consider for personal considerations. I certainly know, we in the LGBTQ plus community are looking for visual cues to see where acceptance and support are. And so, certainly Pride Month, you're going to see all sorts of rainbows everywhere and everywhere. I'm seeing them on your backgrounds, and I'm grateful to see that. But those are visual cues. You might have a lanyard with you have your name tag. You might have a rainbow lanyard. You might have pride pins. I've got a couple of examples there. Sharing your pronouns or having stickers with your pronouns on them are other visual cues to show inclusion. Maybe including your pronouns on your name, on these virtual platforms, your business cards, your emails, and then just sharing those with others are so important, and they demonstrate inclusivity. If you've got your policies and procedures prominently posted in your office, make sure they include sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Certainly on your website, if you've got those policies, where folks in the community are going to be checking out resources before they may go and set foot in those locations to see how inclusive. And if you're marketing, you got your website, your social media platforms, do you have visual representation of same-sex couples, of transgender people, of different races, different nationalities, different accessibility identities? Those are all important things that folks are looking at. This is my mantra, and I just invite you to do the same. Let's just all avoid making assumptions. It's kind of, we're wired to do that, but we can undo that. And so, asking open-ended questions without making assumptions. Maybe when we're inquiring about person's relationship status, if it's appropriate, that we're not assuming that person's relationship, maybe using terms of partner or spouse and not assuming the gender of that other person. When we're inquiring about a person's familial status or family relationships, maybe include references to caregiver instead of parent, or using gender roles of mother, father. We know family dynamics can be so unique. Different people can be taking care of young people. And so, caregiver is a good, inclusive, non-assuming term that can be used. This is a newer slide, but I always think for everything that we're learning throughout our lives, there's some things we're going to have to unlearn. Language changes and evolves. We learn things that may, someday be, inappropriate or offensive. And so just being mindful of that. So here's a couple. These aren't just exclusively around the LGBTQ plus community, but these are just a few I wanted to share. Avoid using terms like blind spot, tone deaf. Those can be offensive terms. We're talking about person with different accessibility needs. And so, using blind spot, tone deaf are offensive. Thinking about Indigenous communities, terms like powwow or spirit animal can certainly be offensive. I've heard this growing up my whole life, even as an adult, so gay. That's so gay. Well, Is it, are you really meaning, what's another term that you can use instead? Avoid using the term crazy. It can be a very offensive term. These are some tricks. I have the asterisk next to queer because that term doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the community approves and or utilizes that term. So really, again, if someone self-identifies using the term queer, it usually means it's an appropriate term, but I wouldn't assert that term to everyone in the community. Avoid, again, sexual preference. We talked about this, lifestyle. These aren't hobbies. These aren't activities. These are really, you're talking about someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And then the ED, I've seen so often this cisgendered, transgendered. And so really it's just, it's an adjective. So we need to use it not in a past tense, as a past noun or verb. These are just a few. Are there others that you can think of before we move on that you've thought about, wondered about? I like the reference here, nibblings instead of siblings, as a non-gender specific term for nieces and nephews. The terms evolve, and so that's a newer one for me as well. And so thinking about some of the gendered language that can be used, and so someone who's non-binary, that term can be inaccurate, can be hurtful. So thinking about other ways that, in asking, instead of assuming, just how would you like to be identified? I want to be intentional and be thoughtful about it. You don't have to know everything in advance. And so just being open, receptive to hearing someone and understanding how they choose to be identified, I think is so important. So thanks for sharing that one. Okay, I've got just a few more slides. We've got plenty of time for Q&A. So I do hope to hear from you. So things you can do professionally. So I'm going to talk about professional first, and then we'll flip over to some personal things. Actively communicating your organization's support for LGBTQ+ inclusion. Maybe engaging with your ERGs, affinity groups. Ryan's a part of one. So you're looking in to see ways to get involved as an ally, because that in knowing that you're welcomed to participate. And if there are ERGs or these resource groups for some of these identities, then exploring ways that you can create them for other identities as well, and allies being a part of each and every one of those. Providing, thank you for being a part of this, the training or celebrating a variety of LGBTQ+ events, as you would do with any other of these groups within your organization. Working with leadership, communications, and HR to ensure LGBTQ+ inclusion throughout your organization. So that might be, ensuring your policies and procedures are inclusive, that your marketing is inclusive, your recruitment, where are you recruiting employees and folks, and looking at the health needs of different communities, I think is so incredibly important. Finally, holding coworkers accountable for homophobic, transphobic, discriminatory, or bullying behavior and language. And I would add biphobic behavior and discrimination as well. So just being obviously making sure you don't put yourself at risk, but speaking out about something that someone said, and just letting them know that it's not a culture that your organization supports. Maybe just providing resources and information so that person knows if they've been offensive, but certainly making sure that they know that it's something that you take seriously. So on a personal level, these are some things you can do for yourself. Educating yourself on where legislation and legislators stand as it regards issues relating to the LGBTQ+ community, and being informed about laws and things that have policies and how they impact the LGBTQ+ community. Reading books, articles, watching TED Talks, films that are created by LGBTQ+ folks. We are so rich, beautiful, and diverse, and represent so many different aspects. And so it's never one size fits all. So I think it's so important just to learn about different aspects of our community. Volunteering with an organization, perhaps. There's always opportunities there, or attending events. Pride Fest is coming up. So let me just do a quick little push for that. So the 4th weekend in June. Historically, it had been the 3rd weekend. We're excited because we're not conflicting with Juneteenth or Father's Day this year. So you can participate in all these festivities, but it's the 4th weekend if you go to our website, which is denverpride.org. I'm going to type it in real quick. all the details. And we're doing that as a hybrid event this year. So we're doing some in-person activities through these pride hubs around the city. And then we're having a virtual parade on Sunday and then a virtual marketplace. So I invite you to check that out. Inviting partners and spouses of LGBTQ plus folks to participate in activities. And finally, asking an LGBTQ plus loved one about their life and lived experience. There may be someone in your family that you've never approached or never really had a conversation or even just shown an interest or had felt like you had the appropriate opportunity to just invite them to share about their lives. And maybe it's talking about a training that you just went to, an event, whatever it might be, but just reaching out to that loved one to let them know that you care and that you'd like to learn about their lives, I think is so important. So with that, I want to stop sharing the screen and seeing you. And I want to look, I know there were a couple things in the chat. We've got plenty of time for questions. So this is wonderful. So if you feel comfortable and you would like to unmute, if you'd like to turn your camera on, you can. You don't have to though, but this is our time to share together. And I certainly want to address any questions. If there's anything I missed, maybe in the presentation that you wanted to cover. Yeah, so there was just the way in which we might reference someone as being, using first language appropriately and being respectful. Yeah, my friend who is gay rather than a gay friend. And so, that's an example of focusing on the person, not that particular part of their identity. So that's a great example. What are some other thoughts or questions that you might have? This would be an opportunity to unmute yourself if you'd like. Of course, I'm going to frame some for you.
So this is Lauren. I put something similar in the chat, but I'm curious about if there are resources for talking with kids about these kind of issues. Like I think someone posted about their 5-year-old. Right now I have a 1-year-old, so obviously he's a little bit younger, but I know like a lot of these things like heteronormativity and that are kind of ingrained in the culture, and the books that he sees and the shows that he sees as well. So I'm just curious if there are resources on things like that.
So most definitely, look, there are lots of books, and I never plug enough the public library system. So you can certainly find a tremendous number of wonderful books and resources there. And then we can certainly provide, lists based on age ranges. I apologize not having that in the workbook, but I'm happy to share that afterwards. But you can certainly do some Google search for LGBTQ children's books and maybe give an age range to see some affirming information books, and there's cartoons, and we're seeing a movement to be more inclusive. I think some of the fundamental things that come to mind would be just allowing that child to identify however they choose to identify. So again, we talk so much about all these gendered toys and clothing and everything. And I mean, it's maybe hard for that particular age, but maybe just finding, as they get a little older, that they can make selections for themselves and celebrate however they choose to present themselves and identify themselves, and not placing so many expectations on how that child should act and behave and look. And I think that'll be, a really important way to remove assumptions and to let that young child figure out for themselves how they want to identify as they get older. I'm going to hit the fast forward button a little bit. So as they're interacting and starting to have crushes on whomever, then just not assuming the gender of that, they may not be in love with anybody, and that's perfectly fine. That's great too. But then just letting them kind of express themselves however they choose. And then, certainly as a parent or a caregiver seeking out support and resources for yourself. You shouldn't, it shouldn't be something that's just isolated for that young person, that child. You should, find resources. So certainly the center provides a number of resources. PFLAG is a wonderful organization for families. Certainly in schools, I think it'd be important just to understand whether it applies to your child or not. Where do they stand on inclusion? And so if nothing else, whether it relates to your own child or not, it's going to relate to other children that they're going to interact with. And so, doing your due diligence in those areas as well, I think will go a long, long way. And what you say is always going to be, kids are listening. Everyone's listening. So they're, particularly kids are watching their parents. How are you talking about LGBTQ plus people? Whether it's a coworker, a family member, or someone on the news, or someone in a television show. So being intentional, not a bull, but intentional on just framing those in a positive manner. And that child will know, that you are an inclusive, supportive person, not only for themselves, but for their friends as well. That was a lot.
No, I think it's a great point about like toys being, as well, like for, I don't know, like when I was young, like a little kid, I had a friend who my parents told me their child couldn't play with me anymore. Their daughter couldn't play with me anymore because we played with cars in our house. So it can get pretty extreme.
Sure.
So I think even just letting like you said, letting the kid have a choice in the toys they're playing with even is important.
And it's something you just have to be intentional. So you may be sitting on the floor looking at all these toys and go, wow, we've got a lot of gendered stuff here. And that's not horrible, but then it's like, okay, let's replenish, or let's figure out, what do you want? And kind of looking and seeing what's available. We're seeing, it's obviously very marketable to have gendered things, but but it's also amazing to find things that aren't always blue or aren't always pink, and things that would really resonate with that child. So,
or if they are blue and pink, that's
awesome.
They don't have to choose the blue one, if they're assigned. I don't even know the right terminology. I'm sorry.
No, you're doing great.
But my son, play with Barbies or things that are pink or whatever.
Yeah.
I really don't care what he plays with. So
that's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and companies are recognizing non-binary, and so we're seeing dolls that are non-binary. I think that's awesome. And so, and having conversations about what that means, I think is so important, so that children can see themselves in their toys and play activities. I think in games, video games, we're seeing recognition and support for all these amazing identities. And so, having those available, I think, are so meaningful to young people. What else? What are some other thoughts or questions? Or
I have a question about how I can best engage and support Pride while not taking up space, maybe for people that are part of the LGBTQ plus community themselves.
Come out. First and foremost, you are welcome. This is an exclusive event. It's such a powerful, I don't think we talk about this enough, but participating in these events, while it's a celebratory thing, it is actually, you are showing your support. And so it means that you understand the community, that you want to be a part of it, that you say you want to be there with others that are allies as well. We don't represent the majority of population, so the significant attendance is really from our allies, and that's so important for us to know and to see. And there's amazing opportunities to interact and see different parts of the community, learn about resources and organizations. As a person who no doubt uses products and as consumables, you can see all these different companies and organizations. It'll be in a virtual context this year, unfortunately, but you will see, so you can make decisions about where you spend your dollars to find these inclusive organizations, and that's through our digital marketplace. But you're not taking up space, you are actually demonstrating support. And so the easy part is you can sit at home and look on your computer. So there's not a lot of physical space being taken, but next year we anticipate being able to be in person again for that. But these Pride hubs, do go, enjoy, learn, we're hosting things at the center as well. If as you feel comfortable being in out in the public, because of obviously we're still at the tail end of COVID, but it's still concern to many folks. But if you feel so inclined and would like to go, do check the website. There's all these amazing activities going on around the city, and you are not taking up space, so don't ever feel like you are demonstrating your support, and it's so appreciated, and so thank you for even considering going, and know that it's not an imposition for us. We would love to see you.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking in the chat also. Let's see. It can be overwhelming, and there's a lot of information out there, but do bear in mind that for the longest time, none of these things were discussed. We assumed, again, that everyone was heterosexual, and that we didn't maybe know the term cisgender. We know the term transgender before we, were using the term cisgender, but so these are identities that may be new. It may seem overwhelming, but we're recognizing that there's a lot of diversity in the community. And I think you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to know all of these terms. It's just helpful maybe just to know if you hear what this term is. Again, go to the workbook. You're never going to, be quizzed on this, but I think it's just helpful to know what some of these terms are, and just being open to understanding that not everybody identifies the same. And so just being intentional and understanding that there are a lot of different identities, newer ones that are coming, that we're learning about. I've certainly, in doing this work, I've learned so much in the last couple of years, and it continues as folks see themselves and identify and connect with other people that share these identities. It may seem overwhelming, but it's important to know that there's just a lot of different identities out there. So, and we're all going to make mistakes. I make mistakes each and every day, and I'm doing this work. And so to think that you're not a bad person for making a mistake, acknowledge it, apologize, and move forward. Hopefully that helps a little bit. What else? What are some other questions or thoughts that you might have? Oh, I'm seeing about pronouns. So, colleague that uses they, them pronouns, and I had a hard time with the subject verb conjugation, sorry. I would work to address them correctly in person, but I would also practice in my brain for future interactions. Yeah, I think just understanding when I haven't met them yet, I don't know what they do. I believe this is theirs. And so just kind of starting to formulate, when, and then know that also that there are other pronouns that can be used as well. And so just when would they apply? And there are a number of wonderful resources, just looking at pronouns. Neo-pronouns is a term used for some of these pronouns beyond they, them, theirs. And there's additional pronouns, sie, them, zir, and other pronouns that can be used. And it really just depends on how a person identifies. And then you can kind of see when you would use these different references when referring to that person. Again, always using it in third person to refer to that person. So an activity that I always throw out there, and it just to practice and to train your brain, is just using different labels, using different pronouns for different utensils in your kitchen. I'm not trying to simplify it, but this could just, or things in your office. Like, I'm going to use a particular pronoun for your cup thing in your office, and different things. And then talk about that cup in different contexts and framing it, and then using different pronouns for something else. Maybe your monitors, she, her, hers, and you're going to talk about that monitor just to practice in a safe space for yourself, and use they, them, theirs. And when would you, for your whatever. And so, just starting to do that, and then switching pronouns. And then as you're talking about these things with yourself or with your coworker, it's a safe way to do it and get used to using these different tenses when we're referring using different pronouns. What is the best way? And I'm sorry, I'm just reading the last one that I see. And if I'm missing some, please let me know and I can go back. What's the best way to address the past history of someone who has transitioned? Things they did in the past. Do we change pronouns? Use the old name. I've heard about birthdays being used for transition days. So I wasn't sure if it was really appropriate to discuss the past with the identity of the present. So referring to someone, so someone transitions and they share their identity with you, more than likely they may change pronouns, may change name. When they share that with you, you should start using that name for that person, regardless of, the name they had before. That term is called dead naming. And so it would be, unless the person tells you differently, and this is just a safe way, is to just always refer to that person by their name that they have shared with you, as well as the gender that they would. And so you can talk about so I'm going to use myself as an example. We're talking about, so if I transitioned and I, now go by another name, and you're going to talk about me in the past, you would still use my name that I share with you from transition. And sometimes we hear preferred name. No, it's just that person's name. But the name that they had previously would be considered dead naming. And so it's best practice is not to use that person's dead name unless they tell you differently, and refer to them in the name that they've shared with you post transition, as well as the pronouns. So you may need to do some thinking about, you're talking about this person's life past tense. You're just going to have to work on referencing them by this name now that through their transition. So and then checking in with that person. And it's not an appropriate question. It's like, how would you like me to handle this? If it's a family member, ask that person. Don't, it's not one size fits all with anyone. So just asking, how would you like for me to refer to you growing up? What would make, what feels right for you, and what would be, what's respectful for me to do? Because some people feel differently. Some people are very public about their identity and wanting to share that part of themselves, but not necessarily, don't assume that everyone does. So I would just invite them to share how they would prefer, and then honor them. But then I wouldn't necessarily assume that applies to everyone in the community either. So I hope that's a safe way to just kind of navigate that situation by asking that person how to be respectful and referencing that. So dead naming a little bit more. So considering when someone transitions and they change their name, that name in essence dies, or it no longer used, it's considered part of their past. And so representing not getting great resources shared in the chat to give you much more context as well. But very high level, think about is, that person, that's a name that's dead to them. And so just continuing to refer to that person. Of course, if it's someone you've known for a long time, we're bound to make mistakes. And so acknowledging it, I'm so sorry. I want to be better. I want to be respectful and do better to try and use that person's name that they share with you as they've transitioned. And so not referring to them, but it takes a while to learn. And so, and I appreciate there's different people sharing personal experiences. And I'm grateful for that as well. But that's it, kind of at a high level, that's using a name that no longer applies to that person. And so we want to be respectful whenever, always to use the name that they share with you as they've transitioned. Other questions or thoughts? We have a few more minutes. So I'm happy to. Oh, I see a digital hand. Yes, please. Would you like to unmute? Yeah.
Hi, Johnny. Thanks
Hi.
so much for this training. Is my audio okay?
Yes, it sounds great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I apologize if you've already spoken to this, but I had a situation at work where I was on a Zoom meeting with a colleague from my organization who I don't really know, and colleagues from another organization. And I knew that a particular colleague from the other organization uses she, her pronouns, but I did not make a point to include pronouns in our introductions. I just said, we're going to go around and introduce ourselves. And so the colleague from my organization misgendered the person, saying, I don't know that guy. So then that forced the person, well, that person did not then share their pronouns, but I felt, should I have spoken up in the moment, or would that just call more attention to the misuse of pronouns? So I felt very bad for the person whose pronouns were, she was misgendered. So after the meeting, I emailed her and said, I really apologize for what my colleague did. Is this something you want to talk about? But I also know it's not your job to teach me about this, and it's not your job to, like, I don't want you to feel obligated to discuss. And so just wanted to hear your thoughts on, should I have spoken up in the moment, in the meeting, in front of the person who used guy in that way, or would it have been better for me to follow up with each person afterward? What do you recommend to be most respectful?
I'll share, and then if someone else would like to share as well. I think in this instance, ideally, normalizing just sharing pronouns and inviting in everybody, so you're not picking and choosing particular people. Oh, tell me your pronouns. I don't necessarily need to know about anyone else's, but just letting that become normalizing that activity, I think is one way to overcome that. And then if it's virtual, then, inviting people, not only put your name, obviously, and when we have a lot of folks, it's hard to see all of that. Maybe your first name and your pronouns, a pronoun, whatever, then that's a visual way for someone that you can see. In a perfect world, it would be maybe correcting if someone's misgendering someone, then you intentionally use the correct pronouns that, oh, they, and in this example, she made a great point there. And then, subtly reinforcing the correct pronouns is one way of not drawing significant attention, because you don't want to embarrass anybody, ideally, but you certainly want to be respectful. So reinforcing the correct pronouns whenever possible. And then ideally, if you can, you just go, oh, you know what, I realized this is something we're doing now, just to celebrate inclusion, is we didn't get to share our pronouns. There's no wrong time to do it. And so, again, obviously this is new to a lot of people, so it doesn't seem natural, but the more and more we do it, the more normalizing it'll be. If you can do it in the moment, ideally, do check in with the person, not only with the person that was misgendered, but then overall just say, hey, moving forward, we want to share, we're going to start doing this, and don't need to disclose why necessarily, but just, let's do that. Let's celebrate inclusion. Let's be more intentional. And that's one way. I'd love to hear any other suggestions. No doubt there's some amazing ideas that others may have that they've literally done in these types of situations as well. So I open the floor.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's a really good question.
I don't think that I have anything different from what you said, but I think if I was in that situation, I would also make sure I address the person by their name and then use the female or the she pronouns, because otherwise the person who used guy may not know who you're talking about, and then that could add an additional layer of uncomfortableness and just saying, I don't know, who's she? Who are you referencing that she in that situation? So I think I would just say,
great point.
Gretchen, you made a good comment. To reiterate, she said these things. And so that would just be something I would add.
Excellent. Any other questions? We're nearly to our time, but I want to welcome last thought you might have. So managing, so how to manage that situation may take some finesse. So just if the person gets offended that you corrected them, you know, there's no, you know, acknowledge, I'm sorry that offended you. I want to be respectful for all of our colleagues that are in the meeting. And so I think that's an important for that. You're not trying, your goal is not to embarrass the person for making the error, but just kind of course correcting so that everyone's being on the same page, and so that everyone's aware of the, you know, of one, of the importance, and then two, just to avoid making assumptions. Again, when you share your pronouns, you're taking the pressure off of having to guess or having to assume. And so in doing it, you're just, I wouldn't want to guess what your name or your nickname would be, and so why would I want to guess what pronouns you use? And so that's just another way of taking the pressure off of having to assume. But if the person gets irate or upset, you know, certainly it's not, you know, sorry, I don't know, you know, we didn't intend to upset you. We just want to make sure that we're being respectful of everyone in the meeting. I think that might be, and if they still are upset, then that might a side conversation with them, maybe in order. And if they become offensive or, you know, disrespectful, then that is another type of issue that you may need to take into consideration, and maybe HR or management needs to be involved. So hopefully that was helpful. Thank you all so much. I'm really, really grateful for your time, your participation. Please take advantage of the workbook. I've got my contact information. If you need anything, please let me know. You're welcome to participate in all the Pride festivities and all the wonderful things, not only that the center's hosting, but there's other wonderful organizations hosting stuff this month. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm really grateful for your time. I'll stop recording.
Thank you.
Thank you.